It was a cold and damp night when it all began. I still remember it as if it were yesterday. It was 1998, and I was the janitor at Jefferson High School, an old institution located in a small Midwestern town. The school, with its Gothic architecture and long, dark corridors, always had a somewhat sinister air, but that night, something different lingered in the air. I had just finished my daily rounds when I heard a strange noise coming from the basement. Initially, I thought it was just one of the many rats infesting the old building, but the sound was different, a rhythmic, almost desperate scratching. I decided to investigate, thinking it might be a broken pipe or something similar. I grabbed my flashlight and descended the creaky stairs leading to the basement. The school's basement was a place we avoided whenever possible. Dark and damp, with moss-covered stone walls, it seemed straight out of a nightmare. As I descended, the air grew colder, and I could feel the dampness seeping into my clothes. The flashlight, my only source of light, cast grotesque shadows on the walls. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the sound grew louder and clearer. It was definitely not a rat. The scratching seemed to come from one of the storage rooms at the back of the basement. I took a deep breath and began walking towards the sound. Each step echoed off the stone walls, and the silence between the scratches was almost deafening. As I reached the room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I approached cautiously and, with a gentle push, opened the door fully. The room was dark, except for a small beam of light coming through a broken window. That's when I saw something that made me freeze in place. In the corner of the room, there was a hunched figure, desperately scratching the stone floor. It appeared to be a woman, but her hair was tangled and covered her face. "Who's there?" My voice sounded weaker than I expected. The figure stopped scratching and slowly turned to face me. When her eyes met mine, I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes were empty, lifeless, and her face was pale as death. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she raised her hand, pointing to something behind me. I quickly turned around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, the figure had vanished. The room was empty except for the scratch marks on the floor. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it all, but the reality was hard to ignore. I decided to leave the basement and lock the door behind me, but I knew something was terribly wrong with that school. In the following days, I began to notice strange things happening. Lights flickered for no apparent reason, doors I was sure I had locked were open again, and whispers echoed through the empty halls. Colleagues started asking questions, but I had no answers. All I knew was that the feeling of being watched never left me. One night, while making my usual rounds, I heard a high-pitched scream coming from the second floor. I ran towards the sound, my heart pounding. When I arrived, I found one of the teachers, Ms. Williams, trembling with fear. She was pointing to the blackboard, where words were written in white chalk, "Help me." I asked her what had happened, but she could barely speak. She said she saw a shadowy figure in the hallway, and when she entered the room, the words were already there. After that incident, I started researching the school's history. I discovered that many years ago, a student named Emily had mysteriously disappeared. Some said she was murdered by a mentally disturbed janitor, while others believed she was kidnapped. Her body was never found, and the case remained unsolved. I began to think that maybe Emily's spirit was still trapped in the school, seeking justice or revenge. As the days passed, the supernatural events intensified. One night, while making my rounds, I felt a presence behind me. When I turned around, I saw Emily's figure again. This time, she was closer, her empty eyes fixed on mine. She said nothing, just raised her hand and pointed to the basement. I understood she wanted me to go there. I descended the basement stairs once more, feeling the cold air envelop me. When I reached the room where I had seen her for the first time, the door was ajar again. I entered and saw that the scratch marks on the floor had multiplied. In the center of the room, something was buried under the stones. I grabbed a shovel I found leaning against the wall and began to dig. After a few minutes, I hit something hard. I kept digging until a small wooden box appeared. It was locked, but I managed to force the lid open with the shovel. Inside, I found an old diary and a small porcelain doll. The diary belonged to Emily. The last pages were stained with blood, and her final words were a plea for help. She wrote that the janitor at the time had locked her in the basement and left her to die. Reading those words, I felt a wave of sadness and anger. Emily had no chance of survival, and her spirit was trapped in that horrible place. I decided I needed to do something to free her. I took the diary and the doll and brought them to the teacher's lounge. I called the police and explained what I had found. The ensuing investigation brought the truth about Emily's disappearance to light. The janitor at the time was arrested but never confessed to the crime. The evidence found in the basement was enough to officially close the case. A ceremony was held at the school to honor Emily, and her remains were finally buried in the local cemetery. After that, the school returned to normal. The supernatural events ceased, and the feeling of being watched disappeared. But even so, I could never forget Emily's empty gaze and the horror she must have felt in her final moments. Jefferson High School will always have a dark place in my heart, reminding me that some secrets should never be buried. On that rainy night, when the thunder echoed through the sky like omens of something terrible, I found myself once again in that cursed place. The abandoned factory, located on the outskirts of the city, always had a sinister air, as if its faded brick walls held terrible secrets. I shouldn't have been there, but something irresistibly drew me to that place. The rusty gates creaked ominously as I opened them, and the darkness inside the factory seemed to swallow all the light that dared to pass through its broken windows. The smell of mold and rust permeated the air, and my footsteps echoed through the vast empty hall. I carried only a flashlight, whose flickering light seemed unable to dispel the dense shadows around me. I knew the history of the factory. For decades, it had been a thriving textile production center, but a series of mysterious accidents culminated in its abrupt closure. People said the factory was haunted by the spirits of workers who died there, but I always considered these stories mere superstitions. As I walked through the dark corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling of a strange presence, as if I were being watched by invisible eyes. My heart was racing, but I continued exploring. I reached the old manager's office, whose walls were covered in mold. There was a desk covered with yellowed papers, and a half-opened file cabinet displayed documents that told the factory's story. Leafing through the papers, I found accident reports, each more gruesome than the last. A worker trapped in a weaving machine, another electrocuted by a loose wire, and so on. The descriptions were horrifying, and I began to realize that there might be more truth to the legends than I had imagined. Suddenly, I heard a noise. Something fell to the floor with a crash, coming from a room at the end of the corridor. My whole body tensed, but morbid curiosity pushed me to investigate. I walked slowly, trying not to make any noise, and when I reached the door of the machine room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were scratch marks on the walls, as if someone had desperately tried to escape. On the floor, dark stains that could only be blood. The room was full of old machines, many of them covered in dust and cobwebs. However, one of the machines seemed to have been used recently, its gears still dripping with fresh oil. My flashlight started to fail, flickering intermittently. Every time the light wavered, I saw glimpses of something moving in the shadows. A low, guttural murmur filled the air, and I was certain I was not alone. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just shadows dancing on the walls, playing with my mind. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I decided to leave that room, but when I turned, the door had closed on its own. I ran to open it, but the handle was cold and immobile, as if held by an invisible force. I banged on the door, screamed, but all I heard was the echo of my own voice. The flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, I saw a pale, disfigured face in the darkness. It was a man, or what was left of him, with empty eyes that seemed to look directly into my soul. His face was covered in scars, and a macabre smile twisted his lips. Fear took hold of me, and I threw myself against the door with all the strength I had. Finally, the door gave way, and I fell into the corridor, panting. I quickly got up and ran without looking back. The corridors seemed endless, and every door I passed was closed. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, and I knew something was following me. I reached the main hall, where the moonlight entered through a broken skylight. I stopped to catch my breath, but the sound of chains dragging on the floor echoed through the empty space. I looked around, but there was no one. Only shadows that seemed to come to life. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned abruptly, and there he was again, the disfigured man. His dead eyes stared at me, and an incomprehensible whisper escaped his lips. I tried to back away, but my legs seemed paralyzed with fear. He came closer, and the smell of death filled the air around him. With one last desperate effort, I managed to break free and ran towards the exit. The rusty gates were in sight, and the hope of escaping that nightmare gave me strength. However, when I reached the gates, they slammed shut with a deafening crash. I was trapped. The sound of distorted laughter echoed through the factory, and the shadows around me twisted into grotesque shapes. The flashlight fell from my hands, breaking on the floor. Darkness completely enveloped me, and all I could hear were whispers and laughter that seemed to come from all sides. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the terror, but the visions didn't stop. I saw mutilated workers, their bodies twisted at impossible angles. I saw machines coming to life, moving as if they had a will of their own. I saw the disfigured man, always smiling, always watching. Suddenly, everything went silent. I opened my eyes, but the darkness was total. I felt a presence nearby, and a soft voice, almost a whisper, spoke in my ear. "You shouldn't have come here. Now, you are one of us." A chilling cold ran through my body, and I felt my consciousness fading. The shadows enveloped me, and I realized my soul was being pulled into the darkness. My last vision was of the disfigured face, now smiling victoriously, before everything went black. I woke up on the street, covered in cold sweat and trembling. I looked back and saw the factory, still and silent as always. But I knew something had changed. There was a part of me that would never leave that place. The psychological scars were deeply marked, and the terror of the factory would haunt me forever. I never returned to that place, but the memories wouldn't leave me alone. At night, I heard the whispers and distorted laughter, and I saw the disfigured face in my dreams. The factory had claimed its victim, and I knew that, in some way, I was forever linked to it.